Welcome everyone to Otessa Online. We are here with Dr. Bonnie Stewart, Associate Professor of Online Pedagogy and Workplace Learning in the University of Windsor's Faculty of Education. Dr. Bonnie Stewart is a longtime educator and digital researcher whose work in participatory learning has spanned all eras of the web. She explores the implications of digital information ecosystems for institutions and society. As an early researcher of MOOCs, massive open online courses, and digital disruptions in higher ed, Bonnie's been thinking about digital systems and their impacts on education over decades. She holds a PhD on Twitter, RIP, and currently investigates what it means to know, to learn, and to belong in an era increasingly marked by digital automation and weaponization. So without further ado, thank you, Bonnie, for your presentation today.
Thanks, Val. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about um, really the idea of agency and what we do as educators today. Like Val said, my background is primarily in participatory learning. Probably like many of you here, I recognize some names and faces from sort of the old web era. I did do my PhD on Twitter, which has been a whole education in itself. But I've been thinking for a long time about open and digital scholarship and how what we do in education and in digital education is always a product of the times and the places that we are. Um, and I've watched real change over almost 30 years in this field, but particularly over the last decade, we're really seeing higher education become, rather than sort of the four walls of the schoolhouse. I've always loved this slide. Fisher-Price takeaway schoolhouse was my most coveted item when I was a 7-year-old. But that four walls of the schoolhouse has now become very much kind of a digital first ecosystem in a lot of ways, from everything from registration to payment systems to alumni networks to teaching itself, to research portals. We are all using this mishmash and collection of often very data extractive tools. And as many folks saw, at least those who had moved to using LMSs, and that is, um, a large portion of the field, that these are breachable places and spaces to have student data on and to have education happening in. It didn't used to be entirely this way. And I know that a lot of you kind of lived through this era with me, so bear with me and come along. But early digital education, if you remember sort of the Web 2.0 era, was about primarily using networked tools and open practices to support the idea of knowledge abundance, the idea that you could contribute and your students could contribute to the learning of other people on the web, not even necessarily people that you knew, put ideas out there, get a sense of who those ideas came from through practices like CC licensing, and let's share, right? Contribute and consume at the same time. It was participatory, and broadly speaking, what it was like a commons of connections that contributed to people's knowledge, agency, and belonging to the extent that knowledge was a networked thing where if I read something by someone, I could click on that person's link to their site, to their blog, to their Twitter accounts, and find out a little bit more about them, gradually, sort of over time, learn where they were connected, who they were connected to, um, and get a sense of how knowledge was being made, and also that I too could contribute to it. But as we all know, the platforms, particularly where we moved away from using domains of our own, like our own blogs, our own WordPress sites, etc., where we moved into corporate-owned spaces like Twitter, Facebook, Meta, also LMSs, but particularly those big public social media spaces, platforms began pushing out the participatory for profits, right? And you saw a real pivot about 10 years ago where the ways in which people used Twitter stopped being of real interest to Twitter decision makers. And instead, what we started to see was a real shift towards a business and media solely approach to these social media platforms. Now, many, many years ago, somebody that I knew and respected and learned a lot from in this field of open education, who I met online, said to me, there are really these three key logics in society. And their business, right? And that's kind of the logic of profit. Media, it's the logic of the attention economy, the eyeballs, and education. And in balance, we manage to keep a functioning society and democracy. But that logic of education is a really important one in that balance. The logic of education values knowledge as a public good, a commons, and a shared human inheritance. In that logic of education, you see the educational values that I'd asked my master's students who come from countries all over the world late last fall just to talk about sort of what they see as the values of education. And these were some of the pieces on that whiteboard screenshot that they came up with. Things like mutual communication, collaboration, logic and reason, justice, honesty, independence, morality. Now, how we define these things is always fraught, but mutual respect, inclusive, caring, critical thinking. I think if you were to put it in the chat, the things that you value in terms of education, we would probably find that there are other pieces that you might want to contribute, and please do feel free to start putting those in. But all of those education values and those things that are behind the logic of education are a real force for democratic agency and belonging and keeping that kind of balance in society. And education practices and pedagogical practices have been a core of supporting those for many, many decades. So we have traditions in education like participatory learning, active learning, discovery-based learning, experiential learning, Paulo Freire's problem-posing education. Those are all educational practices that many of us have at least some experience with that are focused on the individual as an agentic decision maker in their own life who brings with them to a learning experience their own knowledge, but that we are building through these education values a society and knowledge together, right? That is the tradition that I see education as rooted in. But increasingly, and over the last 10 years especially, our enclosed information system, right? The one that has had all of these digital first and extractive tools kind of taking over what higher ed and education is, those tools do not necessarily inherently foster the logic or the values of education. So this is the problem that I'm kind of approaching this conversation from. And for some of you, it may be a shared problem, something that you too have grappled with. For some of you, it may be like not something that maybe is your priority, but um, for me, because this has been what I do and what I believe in for a long time, I have really struggled over the last decade and particularly last few years to engage in digital education in the ways that I once did. Because every platform that I bring my students onto, and my students are future teachers for the most part, or practicing teachers, kind of feels like this lovely bathroom. Please, go ahead and do your thing, and we'll just be over here staring at you. I love that side. And in that ecosystem that has become a glassed-in bathroom, there's this giant elephant in the room right now that is taking over and amplifying all of the problems and risks that already existed in digital education, and that is AI, generative AI. And it's hard to talk about AI in a sense because the term means all kinds of things, and I recognize that. Karen Howe, who wrote Empire of AI, and we'll return to that a little bit later, her work is really great. I highly recommend it. She points out that part of the challenge of talking about AI is that we are all talking about different things, right? It's like the word transportation. Am I talking about a bicycle or am I talking about a rocket? Yes, they both take you places, but the speed and the impacts societally, environmentally, hugely, hugely different. And AI kind of is the same thing. So I would assume, and if this were a different, if I had a little more time, I would love to have kind of made this with an open chat to get a sense of where everyone is at with AI. I know that AI has a lot of uses, and there may be folks in the audience today going like, but I use it for this and it's great. Yes, absolutely. I think that the user refuser polarization that we've been seeing over the last couple of years is a serious distraction. AI has uses, especially close up. You may find things in the work that you do, depending on what you do, where it is helping you in ways that are meaningful for you. Yes. What I want to do is take that more 5,000-foot view and look at that ecosystem that is built on an already fairly polluted digital education ecosystem, digital ecosystem writ large, and talk about the risks, specifically through an education lens. Because, to an extent, and this is Bruce McKinnon's comic from the weekend as Canada released its AI strategy. Um, Here we are as infants putting our fingers in the socket. I think we are taking a little bit of a F around and find out approach sometimes to the risks, even though they are, to many of us, actually quite visible because we've been grounded in the patterns of how Silicon Valley and tech work for a long time. From an education position, my fundamental argument is that in education, you can foster efficiency or you can foster agency, but you actually cannot usually do both particularly well. This is from David White in the UK. He talks about the distinction between learning as efficiency and that actual learning as we tend to frame it in education is often far more about facilitating becoming, right? Yes, there are things that you can learn where learning it quickly is of value, but efficiency is not usually the primary goal of our societal concept of learning. Rather, the societal concept of learning and that human inheritance in which educational values and that commons of knowledge are built is in the idea that the individual learner is becoming a person who can then do more in the world, right? Learning is meant to amplify becoming an agency, not just make you a faster um, sort of bastion of cute facts that you can spit out. And so with AI, there are, again, uses. Personalized learning has been one of the things that education's been sold pretty hard. That sort of step-by-step pathway that you need to get to a goal. There are real assets to people using search in ways that do give them a better starter piece of info where they can kind of digest it and maybe understand a little bit of context about something, as long as it's accurate. But when we get down to things like to help with schoolwork, to summarize, to get news, anything that you are doing that is AI based is based on predictive statistics and what is already out there on the web. And that is not everything. This comic is by Nick Susanis, who always does a beautiful job of sort of visualizing um, his academic work. And he points out here at the top, you see the A to B version of learning, which is often the vision that we are being sold in education when people are telling us, oh, we need AI in this. A to B, great. Some versions of learning are that way. Some tasks are that way, but learning is becoming learning that is not for predetermined paths does not respond well to those kind of algorithmic patterns. Also, Gen AI is flattening our capacity to engage in meaning making versus assignments. I've been teaching for 30 years now. It used to be that I would assign things. I expected students to come up with an output. They were going on this kind of seesaw journey where the fulcrum in the middle, right, was flawed, but I could make an assumption that somewhere in getting to that 5 paragraph essay or that digital artifact, that they were learning, if I designed the assignment well, something that was focused on the actual like learning, becoming ideas that I wanted them to engage with. Now, when they can just generate an output like that, I can't snap my fingers. I don't know why I tried to do that. That process is flattened. That whole seesaw is kind of lying on the floor if the outputs are our major representation of learning. So we've got to change the ways that we think to an extent with this. Um, but that idea of you can just get to the answer that AI also reinforces undermines practices of copyright. It undermines open practices of CC licensing because that is still a social contract based on ideas of opening up copyright. It undermines intellectual property, all of those traceable foundations of scholarly knowledge, right? I work with a lot of graduate students, and one of the biggest things that I know it took me probably into my PhD to fully grasp is that the actual social contract of academia and scholarship is that you are showing with every claim that you make how and who the knowledge that you are using and deploying is based on, and then kind of building your own argument on the shoulders of all of those other thinkers. And those traceable foundations, when you trawl them into kind of an AI quick output, a summary, who did what gets lost. But also, we are starting to see that research itself, right? The false citations that AI generates then get quoted by other real papers. And people are seeing slot metrics show up. We used to have alt metrics. Now we have slot metrics where I got notice about a month ago that I had citations on a paper that I never wrote, but it is similar to a paper that I did write that I would love to have cited, but instead I have this false citation or slot metric that is not based on knowledge. It doesn't even do me any good in the prestige economy of, hey, I have a citation. It's just this garbage process. And the more slot metrics are out there, the more AI will continue to cite them. So our whole foundation of kind of scholarly citation is pretty precarious right now. Also, a lot of our research methods. I don't know how many of you are researchers, but surveys, we can no longer trust that survey responses are coming from real people. Um, Also, just privacy more broadly. There are all of the big tools that are developing their models are trawling the work, particularly that those of us who've worked in open for a long time have put out on the web without respecting the citation or credit elements of that work. And even though we have specific Canadian privacy laws, and there is a lot of talk right now about digital sovereignty, companies are simply not respecting that. Bigger risk, there are serious risks to knowledge as something that is not just an auto-tuned, flattened AI version of what is out there to be known. This is a Guardian article on creating a global knowledge collapse because so many people's knowledge is not actually in the AI corpus, right? AI was trained on the web, and the web is still a global north construct, largely male voices. The representation of actual human knowledge there is not complete, but increasingly what we're seeing is, oh, AI doesn't include that, so it almost like doesn't exist. Woohoo. And yet, in the current consolidation of power for all those problems, the consolidation of power that is happening around Gen AI has education on the front lines. So I want to look at that a little bit. I also love this slide. The future is reduced for quick sale. AI is a fascinating term because, like Karen Howe said, it doesn't exactly mean anything. It's a 1955 term that is still being used 70 years later to mean the future. But some futures are absolute hype, right? We heard that AI was going to make things a lot easier. In fact, the Wall Street Journal, that wild left-wing rag, not is claiming, hey, actually, it's just more work. Um, and I think that this is really important at this point. Many of you may be familiar with this, the Gartner hype cycle. The Gartner hype cycle is a trademarked visualization of the pattern by design that Silicon Valley companies and tech releases and trends go through um, when they are released. Now, the Gartner hype cycle was trademarked in 1995. Gartner exists as a company in Silicon Valley to tell other Silicon Valley and tech trend type companies what and where they are on this trademarked cycle. The innovation trigger on the bottom left is the point at which the hype begins. This is how Silicon Valley makes its money. The innovation trigger is the release of the new innovative tool or trend. What happens then is that the logics of business and media take over, and the the media, the articles start, the buzz begins. That's the term I'm looking for. I'm sorry. The buzz begins. Oh, hey, have you heard about this new innovation? It's going to be the next big thing. Oh, hey, this is going to be amazing. Look at the change this is going to make. This is a by design coordinated effort among business and media entities in this part of the world to create this buzz. And when this happens, as the trend goes up the cycle, the money goes in. This is where the angel investors get involved. This is where the venture capitalists go, oh, this is going to be the next big thing. And it goes up. Right now, we, you are here. We are all at the peak of the top of the largest hype cycle ever released, which is the AI hype cycle. Every other hype cycle preceding it. Does anybody here remember NFTs? That was the hype cycle of 2021 too, just before ChatGPT was released. What happened to NFTs was that people were spending millions of dollars on digital representations of art that they could own, and suddenly people kind of realized, oh, this doesn't seem to actually have a whole ton of real world value, and they dropped way down to the trough of disillusionment because all of the claims that get made while the cycle goes up, this is going to be a tsunami of disruption, is a big favorite, um, are actually just empty hype meant to make money. Gradually, with many things, maybe not NFTs, you will see that sort of slope of enlightenment plateau of productivity happen. The person who named the Gartner hype cycle was a former English major in 1995 and named these all after Pilgrim's Progress type of way stations. That slope of enlightenment and plateau of productivity, I think Val mentioned in the intro that I was involved in early MOOCs in Canada. Funny story, the term was coined in my house by my partner to talk about a small Canadian experimental grassroots kind of open education where different People who were not registered for university courses could still participate in those courses in a very networked kind of way, thanks to it started by Stephen Downes and George Siemens. Stephen created something called Grasshopper that would bring in blog posts, even from people who were not registered in the course, but everybody could. It was that same kind of Web 2.0. You can consume and contribute at the same time, learning together. Great, very best. Maybe in 2010, like, I don't know, 10,000 people in the world knew about this. But the New York Times had done a small article on MOOCs in early 2011. And then Sebastian Thrun from Google got hired by Stanford to do an artificial intelligence course. And he opened it to the world. They had 150 or 200,000 registrations. I don't remember now. The New York Times was obviously like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. The Silicon Valley hype cycle went to work, and the term MOOC was applied to the Stanford model, which was completely different in its pedagogy and its approach, and much more about just kind of go through the course content and complete it. But the term MOOC became the next big thing. And so there we were sitting in our house in PEI, suddenly watching this hype cycle happen about a thing that we realized was never meant to be any of these things, and a term that was never meant to be any of these things. And so I've watched that cycle up close, watched it drop. MOOCs have found their plateau of productivity. They still exist. You can take a course from MIT and you can get a little certificate if you want, but they did not disrupt education on a mass scale, and they were never going to. The whole thing was hype, and that is a feature, not a bug, in anything coming out of Silicon Valley. That is really important to understand, especially when we're talking about AI, because what a hype cycle really is a speculation boom. It's a tulip craze in search of a functioning business model. They wanted MOOCs to find a business model that would disrupt education. They did not. We are now having unwanted AI in every single thing we do because they're trying to find a business model that works to protect all of the money that they've put in. None of it is happening by accident, right? This is a representation of a billionaire AI founder on stage giving a TED talk saying, what if I told you there was a product that would make all of your lives much worse, but me much richer? This push to insist that this tech is so profound that the world has to adapt and shift around it should be a sign. I remember that people were excited about the internet. I know that people are excited about aspects of AI, but this is being pushed into every single thing we do. And the real purpose of it is to keep the money in the billionaires' hands. And that is big AI. And so I want to use again Karen Howe's great distinction here. She frames big AI as distinct from just the technical capacity of AI and Gen AI. She talks about big AI as like a socio-technical assemblage, an entanglement of culture and money and digital capacity and power, mostly power, that includes billionaire business logic, tech solutionism, that like technology will fix things, and anti-democratic politics, and this lure of innovation. And big AI is the thing that I think education especially, but society more broadly, needs to be particularly careful of. So if you are using small model AI to do something that benefits your life, more power, very best to you. But when we are using big AI platforms and we are using big AI platforms increasingly daily because you can't do a Google search without using them now, um, we need to be really mindful of what this is doing, right? Big AI's push into higher ed is no more about learning than asking a tobacco company to help write the school smoking policy. Basically, vendors and billionaires want public money and youth practices, social practices broadly, but especially youth practices, locked into AI before the hype cycle slumps or the bubble bursts. Um, we've been seeing for about 6 to 10 months that tech companies, while the bubble is real, the inflation is up there, the money is in. they are not actually seeing a significant bottom line impact from adopting it. And so that chase of the business model is not necessarily succeeding. So the move has been, well, it's inevitable. We can't do anything without it. I don't know if we have any Simpson fans here, but the electric train episode, this is the Music Man guy who comes to town and sells them on the monorail. And now we are getting a sense that AI data centers are our only future. This is our only option. This is the future. And that's a hype capture because I think a lot of us know that AI data centers, which could emit more greenhouse gases than entire nations, threaten meaningful work, threaten viable climate futures, um, also are diminishing meaningful democratic processes, right? Here in Canada, we've moved to digital first generally and AI informed reviews of people's immigration applications. We rejected an application by someone who was coming from the Sorbonne as an academic because she didn't have the qualifications required for the role that she was going to take up in academia. One of the requirements was something like can use a hammer. Um, those things don't match. But the problem with digital first systems is who does she call? Who does she actually address about that flawed decision when no individual has made that decision. When no individual makes a decision, no individual bears accountability. And so this is kind of for an academic conference, probably a fairly obvious problem in terms of an academic application, but these are our democratic systems that are being outsourced to this situation. And this is the logic of business and media. This is not how education actually works. Um, it does not make sense. Um, Myra Cheng and Dan Jarofsky of Stanford published this recently in science.org. Sycophantic AI decreases pro-social intentions and promotes dependence. The purpose of a system is what it does. We are being trained on a system that discourages us from building our social capacity, our democratic capacity as citizens and as a society. And again, this isn't about technical AI so much as it is about that assemblage that is big AI, which stands to benefit strongly, particularly in terms of its political and power ambitions, from us being less pro-social, having less agency, being more dependent. So I realize that's not cheerful. How do we get beyond big AI to reclaim and recenter the logic of education, right? I think the first thing, we need to stop treating it as inevitable. We are in capture to a narrative right now that tells us, well, this has almost already happened. But almost already is not the same as happened. And I think that there is a specific responsibility for all of us as educators right now to really stand up in this time. I've been drawing on Marshall McLuhan again in my own work. This is from a film of his from 1967. There is absolutely no inevitability as long as there is a willingness to think. So I exhort and invite you to think with me briefly for about 5, 6 more minutes, just about how we can think about education beyond big AI. We can choose things like alternate tools, right? We all know now that really Google search is dead. It is entirely AI as of about 10 days ago. But we can use things like UDM14, which is an open source tool that it's basically Google before AI. We can use different browsers. We can use DuckDuckGo. There are all kinds of tools out there that do not continue to hand over power to the big tools. We can choose alternate Gen AI if we want to use Gen AI because it has value for us. We can use things like Justice AI GPT. We can also have and encourage our institutions to build our own kind of walled garden versions that do the things we want based on um, corpus and data set realities that work for our institution, but that are not bringing in that sort of entire trawling of the web that is happening with big AI tools. This is really important and very specific for scholars. We can advocate for regulation and procurement that protects data privacy in research. Did you know that if your campus administrators, and this is not just about AI, but about, again, the entire digital ecosystem that we're in, that your campus administrators may have access to your full hard drive, including research data, which places you in violation of the TCPS and whatever data access management plan was approved by your REB. So talk to your union if you have one, talk to your REB. We These conversations are so deeply inside baseball, and many times our IT offices are so deeply trying to protect against hackers and ransomware that that's been the focus. But the actual alignment of how these four walls of the classroom that we're in that are now this cobbled together mess of digital tools may not actually align with the agreements that we make. These are pathways to push back against some of this enclosure and control. Start to have conversations on your campus about consent. Um, Campuses are sensitive to the term consent and consent culture for very good reasons. And if we talk about non-consenting use of putting people's work into AI, this may be a way to raise kind of the give a hoot factor in our campus conversations about how we can do this in ethical and reasonable ways, or perhaps do it ourselves rather than utilize big AI tools. We can band together to protect communities and water resources. California City, June 4th, last week, votes to permanently ban data centers. The vote was something like 9-1. I thought this was promising and hopeful. But second, we hear a lot about AI literacy. AI literacy is not actually about AI or tech skills. I reject the idea. It's relatively easy to use the Google version of AI and get some answers. And teaching people how to do that seems like a really odd approach to literacy because literacy in its original use is not actually about being able to like decode, right? Reading is when we teach literacy to small children, we're teaching two things. One is we're teaching them to decode. We're teaching the phonics and can they read CAT as cat, right? Do they know the sounds? But the larger piece is, do they know what a cat is? Can they make meaning from what they have actually read? Can they contextualize it? The questions that we ask in like high school English classes about students' literacy in relation to Shakespeare, for instance, is not can they read the words? Do they understand that thou is the same as you? It's do they understand what is happening in the story? Do they get the context? Do they get the conflict? Can they pull together the big picture and make meaning? All literacies are about making meaning, understanding context, and applying expertise. And in learning, especially, right, some of us may be able to use even big AI systems in ways that work for us because we have the expertise and the literacies to critique the outputs. But for students, where they're meant to be learning those very things that will create their expertise, we probably need to be careful but how we're embedding those ideas and take them through the processes of learning rather than just trying to get to outputs. Because if everything goes wrong, they will not have the expertise to solve problems, right? And I loved this quote. This is from Wonky in the UK last year. If we can't evaluate what the machine is giving us, we're not using a tool. We're being used by one. So our Prime Minister's announcement last week that we need to spend all of this money on AI literacy, because the real problem is that KPMG, the consultant class that seems to have captured our government, ranks Canada low in AI trust. To me, not trusting big AI systems could actually be seen as a wonderful sign of Canada's AI literacy, that we have something to build on here, and we could build a much more critical society without putting more money into spending, getting people dependent on tools that we have not regulated or critiqued yet. I think when we think about literacy, what we need to ask is what literacies are we actually wanting learners to build, right? Are we wanting them to become good users of non-transparent systems that are owned by billionaires so that they are compliant within those systems? Or do we want them to learn and navigate knowledge abundance and make decisions for themselves as democratic citizens with agency who understand the context of what they're doing? If we are going to survive, thrive, protect democracy and higher ed in a world that is increasingly owned and enclosed by billionaires, I think that that latter piece is really key. And this is where we come to the last piece. We can recognize the big AI hype as a Trojan horse for loss of agency. What we are being sold in all the places where AI is being pushed at us is a vision of a rentier economy that is enclosed by power that we do not get to contribute to. And for the most part, is not actually transparent to us in terms of what does our engagement mean, right? What are we selling in terms of our data? How are our choices being constrained by these systems? They are by design not showing that to us. If we buy this Trojan horse, I think we buy a very different future than I was necessarily imagining even 3 years ago that my kids would become young adults in. So, as a sector, I think our cost benefit analysis on AI and learning more generally needs to be guided by our educational values, right? We need that lens of our educational values. That balance in society that, yes, there's going to be a profit motive. Yes, there's going to be an attention economy, but there also needs to be that educational logic that says we care about equity, we care about justice, we care about inclusion, we care about democracy, we care about all of those things. We care about logic and reason. Uh, those are part of what we writ large, all of us here are positioned to protect. This is kind of our moment. Now, we're already doing stuff that isn't great for agency. This is Clarissa Sorensen Unruh's work from New Mexico, and she just kind of mapped the way that different kinds of assessments support things like student agency and student learning. And you'll notice that on the bottom left quadrant, grading on a curve, traditional grades, and equity. Basically, grades tend to move against agency for students. So there's a lot of things that are already happening in our systems that make it really easy to turn things over to AI because we had already kind of moved to a more transactional, higher learning system that may not have been entirely about becoming. I get it. But I don't think we've completely sold the farm yet. So this is my partner's work from last week. It's just a Venn diagram. It's for discussing AI in assessment. You'll notice that AI isn't in the diagram at all. It's human-centered, and it's three key questions. Did they do it? Have they learned? And are we helping them learn? We do not need to put AI at the center of what we do in education because ultimately these kinds of questions are actually what fosters the learning piece. That is our jobs. Our classrooms can be real and genuine sites of critical agency building for learners. It's hard to read, but this is the lintel of a school in New Jersey. And it says the public school is the best defense of a democratic nation. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I encourage you to think about your work this way this year because in our classrooms, right, online or face to face, we do have a chance to still foster some sense of we, right? A participatory commons that people can connect to each other, that people have a sense of who thinks what, and whose ideas and how they know that person and how they trust that person, rather than just that kind of central vision where AI is the connection between us. Um, I want to encourage you to think about your classrooms as the image on the left. Last piece. This is from Will Richardson a while back, but I thought it was really important. We have all this push for like AI is the future. We got to do the future. Education is not actually about preparing students for the future. It is preparing students to care for the future, to care for the world in which we all live, to ensure that there is a future beyond just profits for our billionaire overlords. And thank you very much. I will stop sharing and I will take a look at the chat now that I can see it. Oh, thanks, folks.